Good evening, everyone. I'm Arnie Eisen, Chancellor of JTS, and I want to welcome you to this evening. We are celebrating two books, and we're celebrating a man who was the subject of one of them, a Festschrift, and the author of another of them. And I just wanted to say how proud I am as Chancellor of JTS to be the host of an evening honoring one of JTS's finest, Neil Gilman, Professor Neil Gilman. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to our librarian, David Kramer, who's really going to be your host for the evening. Welcome, everyone.
So, good evening and welcome to all. I usually begin these events by saying this is the next in a series of book talks sponsored by the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And on one level, it is the next in a series of book talks sponsored by the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. But this is obviously a special event. It's a special event because it celebrates, first of all, two books and not one. And they are two books that will help us pay tribute to and celebrate the thought and contributions, both his own directly and a little bit less directly through colleagues and students of Professor Neil Gilman. The fact, Neil, that there are so many people here who you know, colleagues, friends, former students, from over the course of many, many years is a tribute to how much influence you have had on all of these many people. And it's really a pleasure for us to be able to get together and to celebrate that. So, as you know from the advertisements, there will be two books that we will be paying attention to this evening. The first is the Festschrift that honors Neil, which was edited by Rabbi William Pleven, and I'll say a couple of words more about that in a moment. The Festschrift Personal Theology. And the second is a book that has not yet been published, but there are order forms on the little stand in the corner there, so you can pre-order this book so that you will be one of the first to receive a copy and have the occasion to read it literally when it is hot off the press. That is Neil's own new theology, Believing and Its Tensions. As we celebrate this evening, it's important that we begin with noting the fact that this evening is not what it would have been because the editor of the Festschrift, Bill Pleven, has unfortunately experienced a personal loss and as a consequence is unable to be here. He's sitting Shiva. We want to extend our condolences to him, our regret that he couldn't be here, and our expression of sorrow for the loss that he's experienced. But he has written remarks, and those remarks will be read by a friend and colleague of his, and so we will have him present, at least in spirit. Noting that sadness, the fact that he couldn't be here, I would like to really emphasize that we're here more than anything else to have a chance to learn about two important new books. For the Festschrift, we are going to hear the remarks of the editor, and then several of the contributors are going to say just a few words. And then thereafter, Neil is going to take the time to speak both about the Festschrift and about his own new book. And if he is willing at the end of that, we'll do as we always do in these book talks, which is we'll provide an opportunity for people to ask questions, and that will be the extent of the evening. So again, thank you all for coming, and I'd like to introduce Professor Phil Lieberman, who is a professor of religious studies at Vanderbilt. I had to extract that from him because when I asked him how he wanted me to introduce him this evening, he said, "I'm a friend of Bill's." And that is the primary connection that he has to his presence here. So in Bill Pleven's absence, I introduce to you Professor Phil Lieberman.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm going to read Bill's remarks unadulterated. He wrote them in the first person, and so for a moment you'll have to imagine that I'm his shaliach. I want to begin by thanking Shaul Magid, who could not be with us, who edits the New Perspectives in Post-Rabbinic Judaism series at Academic Studies Press, under which this book is published. Shaul helped make this book's publication possible, and I'm very grateful for his support and guidance. Joel Roth is here, and I want to thank him and Elliot Dorff not only for their contributions to the book, but for their guidance at its inception. I want to thank David Kramer for spearheading this event, and Tom Cadgden, and to the events and library staff for making it happen. Finally, I'm so grateful for the presence of Neil's family, Sarah, Abby, and Debbie, and their families. Their support for this effort has meant a lot for me. Neil, while I have no formal appointment to do so, I want to speak on behalf of the many students you have taught here at the Jewish Theological Seminary and remark on 3 ways you have impacted us and our education here. I was reminded of the first way recently when I attended a program here at JTS about the relationship between Mordechai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel, and I want to acknowledge the presence of Mel Scult, who presented on Kaplan's legacy at this event. Mel also contributed an article in this volume on Kaplan as a teacher of Midrash at JTS. The recent event at which Susanna Heschel represented her father's legacy was a powerful statement that these 2 thinkers represent the greatest of the seminary's legacy. Neil, all of us here know that for nearly 4 decades, you have been keeping the legacy of Kaplan and Heschel alive, not only separately, but in conversation with each other, in ways that have greatly enriched our appreciation of each thinker and our own theological language. The second way was that you brought your teaching to every student at JTS. Neil, many people think of your role in the education of rabbis, but we all know that you have devoted so much energy and attention to teaching all the students at the Jewish Theological Seminary. In particular, you insisted that the development of a personal theology should be part of the education of undergraduate students who come to JTS for a well-rounded Jewish education. And you saw to it that graduate students in education would learn not only how to teach about God and tefillah, but to make theology central to their personal educational vision. This brings me to the third way you have impacted our learning here, which is expressed in the title of the book in your honor. As I explained in the introduction, I chose to entitle the book Personal Theology because I believe it captures your distinctive contributions to Jewish education and Jewish theology. As an educational tool, the notion that a person should write a personal theological statement has opened a door for those looking to connect to Jewish tradition on a spiritual level in a way they did not know was possible. You have given many a great gift by introducing and encouraging this medium of expression. Theologically, I think what you've been teaching is that the reason our tradition speaks of Shiv'im Panim LaTorah, 70 perspectives on Torah, as well as 70 names for God, is that there is a different way we call to God and experience God, depending on who we are and where we are at that moment. As Jews, we have our particular names for God, but you have taught us that within this cultural framework, we must personally embrace and affirm our understanding of how God works in our lives in order to use the names of Jewish tradition meaningfully and authentically. Thank you for teaching us, thank you for challenging us, and thank you for caring for us.
Thanks. I just have to say that during the reception for alumni before this event began, several people came up to me and said, I just want you to know that the first serious writing I ever did on theology was at Neil's insistence. So it reflects well the experience of many people. I have to interrupt myself and the program by saying that listening to Bill's remarks, I was reminded of the importance not only of making notes for oneself regarding what one wants to say, but for reading those notes so that one doesn't forget what one wants to say. And I want to also add my own welcome to Neil's family. It was right here in my notes, and I read right past it. So there are several of the contributors to the volume who are here, who have asked, or we have asked, or Neil has asked, to say a few words. And so I'd like to invite each of them. I'll begin with Rabbi Professor Art Green, who is the rector of the Rabbinical School at the Boston Hebrew College. Art?
Neil, it's a great pleasure to be here, and these remarks were conceived within the last few minutes. I belong to an in-between generation. I was a little too young to be a peer and a friend of people like you and Yochanan and Gene Wiener. You were the guys when I was a rabbinical student who were already young administrators and faculty of the seminary. And I'm too old to have been your student because you weren't yet teaching then. At the same time, I knew you, we've known each other for more than 40 years, and I knew you even then. You were working on your dissertation, you were serious about both philosophy and theology. You dared even then to say critical things about both Heschel and Kaplan. I remember the conversations in the hallways then and raised my eyebrows significantly. You took theology seriously in an institutional context where theology was not taken very seriously. And that was a terribly important and even courageous thing to do. And you have been, I would say, a courageous theologian all the way through, and that's what I think of most when I think of you. Taking on difficult topics, taking on theology of death and dying and the issue of the afterlife, which is something that Jews have tried to put into a pinani dachat because they didn't know what to say about it, and having the courage to take it on was very important. Standing up among all the Gedolim who came before you in your book and trying to stake out a position when so many positions had been claimed, finding your own place. I remember Rabbi Nachman saying, Kol yamai gadalti ben hachachamim, means I became strong, I became gadol because I was ben hachachamim, because I saw all their disputes and that made me grow. And I think of you as such a person who grew ben hachachamim. So it's a real pleasure and honor to have been invited to participate in the volume. I didn't know how appropriate my article would be until I just saw the title of the volume was Personal Theology. So I'm especially happy and delighted to be here with you. Yisher Koach and Mechayel Echayel.
Thank you. Those who know Neil's approach and his colleague and our friend, Rabbi Professor Joel Roth, would not have anticipated the relationship that developed between them, I imagine, if only because they're oriented in significant ways in such different directions. But they took that on the road, and they engaged in the most wonderful conversations about theology and halakha in a way that was spellbinding for huge groups of Jews across the country. And so it's a particular pleasure that we can invite Rabbi Roth up to share his comments.
Thank you, David. Listen to the title of the book we celebrate tonight in honor of Neil Gilman. Personal Theology, Essays in Honor of Neil Gilman. That title encapsulates the essence of Neil's mission in life, to challenge and push his students and colleagues each to develop his or her own personal theology. It is hard to believe, but almost 6 years ago to the day, we held a retirement party in Neil's honor on April 26th, 2007. Please indulge me for a moment as I quote to you one paragraph of what I said that evening in his honor. I'll tell you when I get to the end of the paragraph. It was a very German paragraph, right? This place has had very many scholars whose teaching has challenged their students to think and confront difficult issues. But if truth be told, very few of them were mentors to their students, both during and after the initial challenge. Not so Rabbi Gilman. He, like the others, felt his mission to include the challenge he presented to his students. But unlike most, he was eagerly there for them as they grappled with the challenge. When one walks by his office on the 6th floor of Unterberg, one can be sure of two things: that the reach nichoach of his pipe will be unmistakable, and that there will almost always be a student sitting there with him, and they will be talking, confronting, and challenging each other. As often as not, these are not students currently in his class, but students of the past, or even students of the school who have never been in his class, but who know that his door is always open and that he is genuinely interested in them, personally and individually, and in their neshamot. Rabbi Gilman has been challenging students and colleagues for as long as I have known him. He challenged me when I first knew him in 1956 in Ramah, Wisconsin. Then, 6 years later, when I entered the rabbinical school and came to him for a preliminary interview, his first words to me were another challenge. "Well, Joel," he said, "do you still really believe in direct verbal revelation of the Torah?" And he has been challenging me ever since. But for me, as for all others who have been his students, friends, and colleagues, the challenges were always understood to be expressions of his personal interest in us and in our answers. It didn't matter to him whether he agreed with our answers or we with his, as long as they were the result of honest, sophisticated, and rigorous thought. He wanted to be our guide and helpmate, our mentor, not our master. And he succeeded for generations to serve this critical function which so few others were either willing or able to undertake. He may have been our professor, too, but he was always, first and foremost, our rabbi. That's the end of that paragraph. Except for the reach nichoach of his pipe, the rest of what I said then remains as true today as it was 6 years ago, and as it was 53 years ago, in 1960, when Neil began his professional career here at the seminary. That's what we called it back then, much more than calling it JTS. This new branding business is very difficult on us old-timers. I received my copy of the Festschrift only last week, so I hope that I can be forgiven for not yet having read the essays contained therein. But I know with 100% certainty that the essays of all the authors, from the eldest, that's me, of course, to the youngest, continue to reflect elements of their personal theologies that they owe to Neil because of the challenges he confronted them with and the ongoing discussions that he has had and continues to have with them. And look at the title of his own new work, which we celebrate tonight, Believing and Its Tensions, a personal conversation about God, Torah, suffering, and death in Jewish thought. What do you think that volume, which I also have not yet held in my hand or read, does? I assure you that it reflects the continued growth of Neil's own personal theology, the result of his own ongoing challenging of himself, by himself and by others. For what Neil demands of his students, he demands equally of himself. As we congratulate him tonight, both on his own new volume and on the volume in his honor, we pray that he may continue to challenge us, to prod us, to push us ad 120 shana, with completely restored vigor, strength, and health. May you, my dear friend, continue to fulfill Rabbi Akiva's interpretation of the verse from Kohelet, Baboker zra et zarecha, v'la'erev al tanach yadecha. Sow your seed in the morning, and don't hold back your hand in the evening. About which verse Rabbi Akiva said, Im he'madta talmidim b'na'arutecha, al teshev milahamid acherim beziknutecha. If you have raised up students in your youth, don't back off from raising up others in your old age. Amen. V'chein yehi ratzon.
And the last remarks by a contributor, I introduce Professor Mel Scult.
I can't tell you how indebted I am to Neil Gilman. In this room 10 years ago, I was giving a talk. I think of Neil as my very good friend. And during the question and answer period, of course, he asked me an impossible question. The most impossible question. He said, is Kaplan a naturalist? And of course, I gave an answer, but I was dissatisfied with the answer. And in a certain sense, the subsequent years were spent in trying to answer that question. But there's another way in which Neil has been helpful to me, because through a series of events, Neil proposed that I teach a course in Mordechai Kaplan here at the seminary. And the point is that I have been studying Kaplan for longer than I remember. It's been 40 years, and I have an enormous amount of material. And because I had to teach the course, I had to organize my material. Neil told me that he thought I would get up and I would talk about Mordechai Kaplan because I would studying for so long, but that's not my way. I spent a year preparing for that course. And so it forced me to organize my thoughts. It forced me to organize the material in a way which was just so wonderful in terms of putting my thoughts together. So I have dedicated my book, which is entitled The Radical American Judaism of Mordechai Kaplan. It's coming out in November from Indiana University Press. And I'm very honored and privileged to be able to dedicate it to Neil, because he is so much responsible for giving me the wherewithal to conceptualize and to organize my work.
And we in the library are immensely grateful for this connection, because we've got Mordechai Kaplan's diaries, but without Professor Scult's taking responsibility for those diaries, they would be far less known than they have come to be. I now have the privilege and honor of moving us beyond the introductory remarks to the essence of the evening, that is our comments and teaching by our dear friend and colleague, Professor Neil Gilman.
Thank you all for being here. This is actually my second JTS Library book celebration. The first one was a number of years ago, and I was absolutely stunned by the number of people who cared enough to come out to learn about that new book. Since then, I have had another quasi-Festschrift, which is the issue of conservative Judaism that was dedicated to my thought with a number of contributions by students and colleagues. I thought that's it for Festschriften. Apparently not, because all along I found out through the grapevine that Bill Pleven had been talking up a Festschrift, not a paperback one, but a hardcover one. And I'm terribly sorry that he can't be here. It was his idea. He planned it. He issued the invitations. He edited it. He dealt with publishers. He monitored the actual preparation of the volume. And he did it basically without consulting me. I didn't know anything about it. I had to sort of squeeze information out of Joel Roth says, have you heard anything about this? And usually the answer was no, and it finally came out. And what a handsome volume it is. It's an extraordinarily handsome volume. Handsome enough to justify its exorbitant price, for which I also had minimal control. Had no control over the contributors, what they said, or the price, or the publisher, or anything. I'm just celebrating its presence. That's all I can do. But I want to thank David Kramer for suggesting that we have another evening about my books, and that with the help of God, I'll be around. Maybe we'll still have a third JTS Library celebration, if JTS Library is still celebrating books by faculty. But I do want to welcome Chancellor Eisen, and particularly to Chancellor Schorsch, with whom I've had a long and complicated and intricate and interesting relationship, on which I will say some more later on. But Dr. Schorsch doesn't exactly waste his time, his retirement days, and that the fact that he took this evening to come and join us here was a great personal tribute, and I'm very thankful to you. Thank you. Thank you. The person who really does the work for these things is Hector Gomez. Hector Guzman. Hector has been the secretary for personal assistant, we don't call him secretary anymore, personal assistant for dozens of people around here. He's been here almost as long as I've been here, and he does the legwork, putting evenings like this together. So, thank you, Hector. I also want to welcome Stuart Matlins, the owner, publisher of Jewish Lights, of whom I will say more in a few moments. Long ago, without his ever having said it, Stuart said, I had the feeling that Stuart and Jewish Lights would publish any book that I gave them. And that's exactly what's been the case. The one that they did not publish at the beginning was Sacred Fragments, because there was no Jewish Lights around when JPS took on Sacred Fragments. But The Death of Death and books about God, and my most recent collection of theological essays, and now the new one also. So, And I listen in disbelief to all of the authors who cry about their relationships with their editors and their publishers. I have never cried about my relationship with Jewish Lights, with Stuart, or with Emily Witchland, who has been my editor since the beginning, and who eases my books into print. I mean, just eases them into print. No tension, no screaming, no whatever. So, Stuart, thank you for coming, and please say hello to Emily on my behalf. My talk, I guess, is about two separate parts. One is a shorter part about the new book, which will, I'm told, be published hopefully early in June. The preface of the book describes how I came to write it. I was deeply involved in doing an anthology of commentaries on the Akeda story, along the lines of Nahum Glosser's Dimensions of Job, using not only rabbinic but medieval commentaries, Christian, Muslim. There's an enormous material, and nobody has ever produced a kind of a more or less comprehensive anthology of commentaries on the Akeda story. And then, because of a personal conversation here, somebody said to me, Neil, now that you're retiring, you owe your students a legacy, which is a statement of where you are today, where you stand today. Pull together all of your current thinking. And that was intriguing. I had done it with Sacred Fragments, which was published some 20 years ago, and which remains, incidentally, an incredible bestseller. I don't understand how and why, but people are still buying Sacred Fragments. But something to bring Sacred Fragments up to date. Because you've changed, you've developed, you've changed. And that intrigued me. Fortunately, I was able to arrange with my then research assistant, Noah Farkas, to take on the editorship of the Akeda volume, and I would serve as a consultant. And in the meantime, I began to work on this legacy book, which I, incidentally, wanted to title the four theological questions, assuming that everybody would pick up the reference to the 4 Passover questions. To my amazement, most people did not. And I don't know if that's why, but Stuart and his people were not exactly thrilled with the topic. And then we talked back and forth, Emily to Stuart, Emily to me, Stuart to me, and everything like that. And what I wanted above all was a book that was not an upbeat 3 cheers for Judaism, 3 cheers for God, how great believing is, but rather reflected the tension, the difficulties in achieving the life of faith. What Heschel referred to when he wrote, faith is not a sinecure. Boy, is that ever true. And Yitz Greenberg, quoting Buber in his first article on the Holocaust, talked about moment gods and moment faith. That faith lasts for a moment, and then you're back in the desert again. That I wanted to come out in the title, and I also wanted a cover scheme which was not red, white, and blue. My daughter Debbie said, you want a more somber color scheme. And that's what I said to Emily, and that's what I got. And I'm very pleased, grateful for the somber, dark-toned cover for the book. Tensions was the last issue to be discussed, and finally I felt that tensions was okay. And then the subtitle, A Personal Conversation about God, Torah, suffering, and death, that was entirely Jewish lights. Stuart, Emily, I don't know who, but that was a genius subtitle because this is exactly what I intended. The reality was that I could no longer type. Because of complications from my various illnesses, I could not use the computer anymore. And so what I did was dictate the book, and one of my research assistants, who, by the grace of God, is here tonight, Gela Solomon, back there. Gela Solomon got me the tape recorder, got me the pocket recorder, and she transcribed everything I said on the 4 topics. I was able to dictate from a lying position, which is as much as I could muster in those days. And the reason I could do that was that these 4 topics had become the center of my teaching. Almost all of my teaching recently has been about those 4 issues. So it was shagur b'fi. It was very much part of, the words were in my mouth. And that accounts for the conversational tone, which I aimed for, the colloquial tone, which I aimed for, and then another grace of God, my son-in-law, Michael Prince, who was a professor in English at BU and who ran their writing program for a number of years, agreed to review the transcript and put it into some more coherent shape than it could be simply coming out of my dictation. And basically, that is the copy that you are going to have. There were a lot of little editing things, but that's the book. It's colloquial, it's informal, it's non-academic. There are very few footnotes. There are very few extended arguments. That's why it's short and relatively inexpensive for a theology book. It also reflects the thinking of a man whom I bumped into because I listened to Bill Moyer's interviews. The man is named Christian Wyman, W-I-M-A-N. He is a poet who has been editor of Poetry magazine for a number of years and is now leaving to become professor of liturgy at Yale Divinity School. Wyman had a long, complicated medical history with a very rare and difficult cancer, which he overcame. He married, and he rediscovered God. And he emerged with a theology which, with the help of Larry Troster, I was able to boil down to 3 adjectives: tentative, subjective, and provisional, tentative, and subjective. Every theological claim is provisional, tentative, and subjective. I can't tell you how that captured exactly where I was heading myself. And I've since read just about everything that Wyman has published. There is a new book and a long review in last week's New Yorker, the one with the fancy red dress on the cover. Not today's New Yorker, but last week's New Yorker. If you still have it, which my sense is people who subscribe to the New Yorker just don't get rid of it so quickly. It's sitting around someplace. Read the review of Wyman's work. It's absolutely stupendous. He captures it right away. And of all people, this was an totally accidental encounter. I mean, I don't listen to Bill Moyers every week. I happened to turn it on, and this guy was there, and he began to talk about his poetry and his history, and I couldn't take my eyes away from him. I then ordered his books, and I began reading. So this is a good segue into the second part of what I wanted to say, which deals with the Festschrift. I could not possibly deal with the contents of all of these articles. I read many of them, not all of them, but most of the ones that I read have to be reread because they represent very, very interesting and I think pushing ahead kind of theological inquiries. The tribute of the article is not so much the conclusions, but of the process, of the fact that each of these articles is an inquiry which takes me through a road until at the end you get to the point where you understand where that particular author is going to and getting into it. But what was interesting about the contributors, which was much more, to me, interesting for tonight at least, than the contents, was the range of relationships with all of these people. My life here at the seminary was a fabric of relationships. Joel Roth referred to the fact that there was usually somebody in the office schmoozing. And from the very beginning of my career, it were people that I met and exchanges that I had that made this place so exciting and that made it possible for me to feel that I can really make a contribution, not necessarily only because of my publications, although David was gracious enough to say that my olam haba is the books that I've done, the articles that I've done. But simply in terms of the people, the incredible range of people that I've met. And it's these personal relationships, many of them in my office, students who walked in, colleagues who walked in, many of them out in the field in my adult education, lectures around the country on theology, personal issues, family issues, halachic issues, all over the place. And these personal conversations and the relationships which they engendered, many of them have persisted to this day. Many of them are with people who are still here and who are in this room. So in place of a commentary on the scholarly content, I want to talk about moments, specific moments, and specific people with whom an encounter or a relationship changed my life. these are transformative moments. Roughly chronologically, but not necessarily. The name Judy Greenblatt, nobody here knows about, or some of you may have heard this anecdote. Judy was sitting next to me in an English poetry class at McGill in 1952. And I like to introduce her by simply saying that Judy was the woman that my mother deeply wished that I could marry. Because her father was a wealthy lawyer and my career would be set. Unfortunately, Judy was not interested in marrying me. But, you know, we sat next to each other. We had assigned seatings. We sat next to each other for the entire day, and we schmoozed. And one day she said to me, Neil, what are you doing for lunch? I gulped, and I said, you know, whatever you're doing for lunch. And she said, I'm going to Hillel. I said, why in the world do you want to go to Hillel? I hadn't set foot in Hillel. I hadn't set foot in anything Jewish since I left Quebec and came to McGill. And she said, there's a lecture. I said, who's giving the lecture? She said, Will Herberg. I said, who's Will Herberg? And so she told me who Will Herberg was. And I said to myself, well, you know, I'm taking a course in existentialism at McGill in the philosophy department. Herberg says he's an existentialist. Fine, we'll go listen. And I'll have an hour with Judy. Well, the hour was ended. Judy disappeared. But I remained. And Will walked over to me and said, who are you? I told him. He said, you want to talk? I said, please. He said, let's go have a beer. We went out, and for 3 days, while he was in McGill at Montreal, lecturing in shuls and at the university, etc., we talked. We talked philosophy, we talked Judaism, we talked Talmud Torah. I didn't know the whole story then. It turned out that he was a Marxist communist on his way and broke with the party when Moscow and Hitler signed their infamous pact. And he walked over to Reinhold Niebuhr across the street and said to Niebuhr, my God is dead, convert me to Christianity. And Niebuhr said, I don't convert Jews. Your God is not dead. Go talk to Finkelstein. I said, so he said, who's Finkelstein? Yeah. So he walked across the street and says, Niebuhr said, I'll call him. He walked across the street and Finkelstein saw him. And Finkelstein said, you need to study. And he said, fine. So he assigned, can you imagine this trinity of teachers, Milton Steinberg, Gerson Cohn, and Herschel Matt. And he had a tutorial with these three people, out of which came Judaism and Modern Man, which is the book, the first serious book that I read about anything Jewish. And I was then in my second to third year at McGill. So I tried to reconnect with Judy. Unfortunately, she moved to London. She died shortly before I was able to reach her, but I spoke to her son. Very interesting family name, Baron Cohen. Not the mother of the actor, but the aunt of the actor. Her son, Baron Cohen's professor, is at Cambridge as a world authority on infantile autism, whom I also met, but very little to do with his cousin. Herberg left Montreal after 3 or 4 days. And I got to know the three conservative rabbis who were in Montreal, Moshe Cohn, Willie Shushat, and my Hillel director, Sam Cass. And I said to them, I have to study. And they said, what do you want to study? I said, I want to study Jewish philosophy. So Moshe Cohn, who was a Harvard graduate, said, if you want to study Jewish philosophy, go speak to Harry Wolfson at Harvard. So I said, who's Harry Wolfson? Well, he said, Harry Wolfson is the dean of Jewish philosophers. He has written every important book, and he's got a chair at Harvard. I said, how do I get in touch with Harry Wolfson? He says, this way. He dialed a number and handed me the phone. And Wolfson said, come to Boston, come to see me. So he was buried, his office was buried in Widener, in the bowels of Widener. I took a train from Montreal to Boston. I sat with him. Amazing, gave me an hour. And he said at the end, what became the mantra, Mr. Gilman, you're a nice guy, but you don't know anything. And there's no point studying Jewish philosophy unless you know Tanakh, Talmud, Rabbinics, Midrash, everything. So what do I do? He said, go to JTS. I said, what's JTS? He said, JTS is the place where you will get a basic Jewish education all the way through. So I said, how do I get there? He said, easy. He picks up the phone and he says, Louis, it was Louis Finkelstein, he says, I'm sending you a student. I then went to have lunch at Hillel, and as I was having lunch at Harvard Hillel, I was paged, and I went back to the phone, and Wolfson was on the phone, and he said, I want you to come back to my office. I have more suggestions for you. And that was the first and last time I ever met Wolfson. But Wolfson, in a sense, changed my life. The Hill director at McGill in those days was Sam Cass. I have to tell you that he was the least personable Hill director conceivable. His accomplishments were not creating personal relationships with students. But he had money from Montreal B'nai B'rith, and he ran an incredibly great program. And everybody who was anybody in the field of Jewish scholarship came to McGill Hillel to lecture. I told him what Ostrom told me, and he said, sure, you have to go to the seminary. I said, why? He said, I'll show you why. He brought me up to his office, and I'll never forget this, his library. He gave me the diploma, the JTS diploma, which in those days had the signature of every member of the faculty. He said, read the names. So I read the names. Louis Ginsberg, Alexander Marx, Saul Lieberman, Louis Finkelstein, et cetera, all the way, H.L. Ginsberg, Abe Halkin, Gerson Cohn. And as I read each name, he went to the shelves and he pulled out the books that these people had written and put them on the table. And this took about 45 minutes, at the end of which you couldn't see the table. And he was extremely non-dramatic person. But he simply stood there and pointed to the books. He says, that's why you have to go to the seminary. So I went. I want to insert here that I did go to see Louis Finkelstein. As Wolfson said, I called Finkelstein, told him, you're coming to see him. I said, why should he want to see me? He said, because I said he should see you. So I went and I spoke to Finkelstein. And that's at that conversation that I think many of you have heard the anecdote, because I had an Orthodox uncle in Flatbush who sent me, who insisted that I not go to the seminary until I just meet J.B. Soloveitchik. I said, what's the point of my meeting Soloveitchik? I don't know any Talmud. I've never studied any Talmud. He said, just talk to him. So I went to speak to him, and I told him who I was, etc., etc. And he said, you don't know any Gemara. You can't come here. Go back to Montreal, get yourself a tutor, study Gemara for 5 or 6 years, and then come back. I said, I can't do that. So he said, so what are you going to do? I said, well, tomorrow I'm being interviewed at JTS. He said, don't go to JTS. I said, why not? He says, because there's no serious Talmud Torah at JTS. So I went, and I was ushered in to see Finkelstein. If any of you remember what it was to sit in that office, it was an incredible experience. And he asked me everything, and I told him everything, including what Soloveitchik said about JTS. So he smiled. And he said, well, I'll tell you. He said, you know, I go to bed early around 10, but I'm awake at 4, and I begin studying at 4. My friend and colleague, Professor Lieberman, down the hall, he goes to sleep at 2. So Soloveitchik is right. Between 2 and 4, there is no serious Talmud Torah at JTS. That's my first Finkelstein anecdote of dozens, but one of the last ones was when he asked me a few months before my ordination, what do you plan to do? I said, I guess I'm writing a dissertation. I guess I'll look for a pulpit near New York. He says, nah. He says, don't go into the congregational rabbinate. I said, you're telling me not to become a congregational rabbi? He said, right. I said, why not? He says, because I'll tell you. Your first congregation, you'll have about 200 families. You'll be a great rabbi. You'll influence them. You'll transform them, etc., etc. After 5 years, you'll move on to your second congregation, where you'll have about 750 congregants. And you'll be an enormous success. And you'll transform their lives. So that's a total of 950. Then, after 5 years, you'll go to your last pulpit. You'll have 1,500 families, and you'll be president of the RA, and you'll be a member of the law committee, and you'll have all of the great accomplishments, and you'll transform 1,500 lives. So add them up, 1,500, 750, and how many is that? I said, whatever it was. And he said, but if you stay at the seminary and you work with rabbinical students, every single rabbinical student that you will transform will himself go off and transform 3,000 families. So you see, how much more will you ever accomplish if you stay at the seminary and don't go out and take a pulpit? I said to myself, my God, is he ever clever? If this ever got out, that he discouraged me from taking a pulpit, well, Wolf Kelman, the Lover Shalom, would have understood, I think. One encounter with Gerson Cohn, when he was making his first appearances here as chancellor, and speaking to individual members of the faculty, he called me into his office. We talked, and he said, why don't you have a PhD? I said, well, I'm halfway through a dissertation, but I'm just bored with it. And I haven't done anything on it for almost 10 years. So he says, that's okay. He says, but I just want to tell you that without a PhD, there's no room for you in our faculty. I said, really? He said, yeah. So he said, you don't have to write a PhD dissertation, but if you want to stay teaching at the seminary, you have to write one. You have to finish it. And I'll tell you what, I'll give you a 6-month sabbatical with pay, and find yourself a place to sit and study and finish it, which I did. And the day of my defense, he called me into his office, poured 2 cups of schnapps, and said to me, "So how was it?" Well, I said, "It was not exactly a coffee clutch." He said, "It's not meant to be." I said, "I know." But he said, "You've done it. You've accomplished it. It's important, and it'll carry you through a career." I had a different but parallel kind of change of career conversation with Dr. Schorsch, which I think he probably recalls. But we had a number of conversations about my retirement, and what I didn't really appreciate was the extent to which, under Dr. Schorsch's chancellorship, my entire career had changed. That's when I moved out of my office in Brush, moved into my office in my new office in Unterberg, and began to publish. If you look at my list of publications, the books and the articles and the book reviews just began to flow. Nothing had been done while I was in administration. I was all bottled up. I just didn't have the time or the energy. Suddenly, it all came out. And it was an exchange which launched an entirely new career for me. It's these kinds of exchanges which are very important to me. Elliot Dorff, I was in Camp Ramah in '56, and Jerry Abrams and McGillner, Alev Shalom, sent me down from Land O'Lakes, Rhinelander, Conover, God help us, to Chicago to bring up the campers after staff week. So we went down to Chicago, and then we picked up the train, Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. I remember it was called Le Flambeau, and it went up and stopped at Milwaukee. And I had on my list that in Milwaukee we're picking up a camper by the name of Elliot Dorff. So when the train rolled into Milwaukee, I stepped out of the train, and there, standing on the platform, laden with shopping bags and suitcases, was this wan-looking teenager. And I walked over to him, and he just didn't know. It was his first summer in Ramah. He didn't know who I was, or I said, "Are you Elliot Dorff?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Welcome to Ramah." He said, "Thank you. What are we doing?" I said, "We're getting you on the train. This is the train that's going to take you up to Conover." And that's when I first met Elliot, and the beginning of a long relationship. That summer, he and I taught him Echa, how to read Echa, and we talked theology. The third person in our theology conversation was my camper, Saul Kripke, who went on to have a great career in mathematical philosophy, who knew more than both of us put together in those days, and who tried to get us to study and read his most recent article, which we couldn't understand because it was all mathematical formulae. So, but this is how I met Elliot. And incidentally, that summer, I first met Joel Roth as well. And his descriptions of our conversations in camp, basically, we felt that Joel Roth was running the camp, because he made all of the announcements. Because he spoke Hebrew, impeccable Hebrew, and he made all the announcements, including at what time do we say Maariv on Shabbos night, you know. How many hours do we wait between this and this? But that was a relationship which was a summer relationship until he came here. Since he has been my colleague here, I have to tell you, and I don't know whether this is to laugh or to cry, he is probably the only member of our faculty who takes theology seriously. And he is a Talmudist, of all people. So he and I, when we're together, apart from the fact that, you know, he's my personal posek and I ask him my halachic questions, he and I talk theology. And as you heard earlier, he and I have a debate, the Gilman Roth debate. And we've traveled around the country debating. Usually the title is The Future of Conservative Judaism, but that's not completely, it's about everything else. It's about God, it's about revelation, it's about halacha, it's about halachic authority, it's about the law committee, it's about what should we be doing. And as he frequently has said himself, sometimes I think that that the two of us are just this far apart. Sometimes I think that we're miles and miles apart, which is interesting and I think true. Mordechai Kaplan, because Kaplan is the first one to say to me, Mr. Gilman, Judaism is whatever the Jewish people say it is. And I said, oh my God, what am I doing here? And it was at that point that I began to realize that Kaplan may be saying it, but a good number of members of our faculty believed it. And that was the beginning of my acculturation to what I began to understand to be conservative Judaism. I want to mention Nachum Shargel, who's here. Nachum and I entered rabbinical school the same year, 1954, and we were walking during orientation period. We were walking down Broadway. I think we were going to a reception and maybe Seymour Siegel, Olav Hashalom's home, or someplace else. And you know, the entering class was just walking down, and we happened to, be walking together. And Nachum said to me, Neil, do you have a roommate? I said, no. He said, neither do I. He said, do you want a room with me? I said, sure, why not? Wonderful. So I got a roommate. But Nachum Shargel came out of Baltimore, and the Baltimore Hebrew College, where he had been studying advanced scholarly Hebrew and Gemara and everything else since kindergarten, almost. And one day, I don't recall, I walked into the dorm room, and he was sitting reading the original Hebrew of Toldot HaYehudim B'Sforad HaNotzrit, as if it were the New York Times. I mean, he was just reading it and turning the page and reading it and turning the page. And I said to him, Nachum, where'd you learn to do this? He said, I've been doing it since high school at the Baltimore Hebrew College. I said, oh my God. I said, is this what I'm supposed to get to become? He said, I don't know. He says, but this is what I do. So they assigned this book, and I'm reading it. That was the beginning of an extended relationship. And I'm just so happy that we've reconnected and that he's here tonight. And I have to say something because Bela is here also, Mrs. Shargel. He was trying to court a young woman who was in the TI. And he couldn't get a date. And finally, she said to him, "Look, I'll meet you for breakfast." So he said, "Fine." So 7 o'clock one morning, he's up, showering, and all spritzed together, and he runs out. And apparently, what happened was that as he walked out of the seminary, he met Professor Shraga Abramson coming in for the minyan. And it was February, it was freezing cold, and Abramson said to him, "Taksor, taksor." And he went on and had his breakfast, and of course the relationship never went anywhere, and he was terribly discouraged, and he came back and said to me, "Neil, I don't understand this." He says, "I have a wonderful woman who's a good friend of mine back in Baltimore. Why am I fritting away my time with all of these relationships here that nothing ever comes of them?" So he says, "I'm going back to Baltimore and I'm going to marry Bela," which is exactly what he did. And Nachum and Bela are both here tonight after a career in Easton, Pennsylvania, and in Harrison, New York, and a very fruitful and happy retirement. I'm happy to say. Recently, much more recently than these relationships, Mel Scult, with whom I have absolutely wonderful theological conversations, Lenny Levin, who joined our department recently and who is an extraordinarily wonderful teacher, and whom I could simply ask him to teach my stuff, and he would do it, like this. He knows me better than, he knows my stuff better than anybody else does. Aubrey Glazer is here, who's at Harrison Jewish Center, succeeded Nachum, and of course Arthur Green, whose book, Radical Judaism, I still believe is the absolutely most accomplished book in Jewish theology that's been published within the past decade. I've taught it a dozen of times, and my own book is very, very different. His book is very closely argued. Mine is much more rambling, much more colloquial. I'd never believed that this would, I think that theologically, I've sort of gone beyond where Arthur was in Radical Judaism, but that's okay, because in his next book, he's going to go beyond me, and then we'll continue this. Finally, if I have, David Kramer reminded me, the fact is that I'm going into I'm in my 80th year. And I said, I don't know how many more books I'm going to write. And I certainly don't know. I am still teaching, incidentally, at Skirball, which is like a second home for me. Teaching much of the stuff that I've incorporated into this new book. But David Kramer suggested, and I have to remember this, that my immortality does not demand my presence. That my immortality is vested in my publications. And they will survive, I hope. I'm waiting to see Sacred Fragments on a blanket in front of Citibank for 98 cents, but I haven't seen it yet. Thank you so much for having me.
Neil, I can't help but recall that our being a people begins with a relationship. that we agree to become deeply committed and for that commitment to continue over the course of generations. What you've just reminded us of is that when we think about God and when we think about our presence in the world where God's presence also resides, but where profoundly we are also sharing presence with the other, with friends, with colleagues, that relationships come back and are front and center. And I don't know about anybody else, but I've been inspired both by the individual models that you've suggested and by the total message that we're here to maintain relationships, to be sustained by them and to learn from them. And I can say personally as well that having been here at the seminary on the same faculty as you have been over the course of these many years, I have learned much from our relationship and from the relationships that you've modeled with our other colleagues as well. So thank you very, very much. Thank you all for coming, and I've got to end very simply by saying that there will be more book talks. And so please look for our announcements, and I invite you back. There are no books to be signed this evening, which makes the rest of the evening easier on Neil, but there are flyers on the stand that you can take in order to order the book. Good night.